The late summer air in rural North Carolina was thick with anticipation and the scent of blooming hydrangeas as Margaret stepped quietly out of the rental car. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, her navy blue dress modest but elegant. She adjusted the shawl over her shoulders, then glanced up at the old barn-turned venue with a knot in her stomach. Thomas's wedding was supposed to be a day of joy, and in many ways it was. But for Margaret, it already felt like a threshold she wasn't quite sure she was allowed to cross. She moved slowly, careful not to twist her ankle on the gravel path. Her legs had grown weaker over the past year. The autoimmune illness that had shadowed her life for nearly a decade was flaring again, a reminder that she could no longer ignore. Yet she smiled when she reached the barn doors, nodding at guests she barely knew, holding back the fatigue that tugged at her every step. Inside, strings of fairy lights hung from wooden beams. Mason jars held wildflowers on every table. Soft music played while servers passed trays of sparkling cider and champagne. The scene was picturesque, like something out of a bridal magazine. Emily had outdone herself. Everything bore her signature touch. The custom menu cards, the vintage tablecloths, the carefully curated playlist. It was all beautiful and completely foreign to Margaret. She spotted Thomas near the front, looking sharp in his tailored gray suit, his arm around his new bride. His eyes lit up when Emily laughed, her hand brushing his chest in a way that made Margaret's heart ache, not from jealousy, but from the growing distance between them. She had raised Thomas alone after her husband passed away, when their son was just 5. Every scraped knee, every late-night fever, every parent-teacher conference, she had been there. And yet here, now, she felt like a footnote. When Thomas finally noticed her, his smile wavered for a beat before he waved. "Hey, Mom," he said as she approached. He kissed her cheek quickly, already turning back toward the photographer. "Glad you made it." Emily looked her over with a polite nod, then gestured to one of the servers. "Margaret, champagne?" "I'm fine with water," she replied, but the server had already walked away. Emily didn't hear or didn't care. Margaret smoothed the front of her dress and took a seat near the edge of the room. She didn't want to get in the way. She was used to fading into the background. That's what illness taught you, how to be small, invisible, even in rooms full of people who were supposed to love you. The ceremony had been short and sweet. Margaret had watched from the front row as her son slipped a ring onto Emily's finger. His hands had trembled slightly. Emily had teared up, or at least pretended to. She was good at performances. Margaret had always thought so. Still, she tried not to judge. It was Thomas's day. His happiness mattered more than her misgivings. As the reception rolled on, Margaret tried to engage in light conversation with other guests, many of whom were strangers. Most were from Emily's side, old family friends, local business owners, her college sorority sisters. Margaret heard whispers about private schools, vacation homes, a fundraiser for a new tennis court. These weren't her people. She smiled, nodded, and kept sipping her water. The toast began just after dinner. Thomas's best man shared a few funny stories from college. Emily's father gave a touching speech about watching his little girl grow up. There were tears, laughter, and lots of clinking glasses. Then, unexpectedly, Emily stood up, glass in hand. She raised it high. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with the attention of the room. "Before we wrap up," she said, "I have a little game I want to play." The crowd chuckled. Emily always had a flair for the dramatic. It's called the auction. Margaret tilted her head, confused. Guests leaned in, curious. Emily grinned. "We all know weddings are expensive. And since I've already paid for everything today," she paused for laughter, which came easily. "I thought I'd try to sell one more thing to the highest bidder." Thomas chuckled beside her, clearly nodding on whatever this was. Emily lifted her glass higher. "So, who wants to take home my sick mother-in-law?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the crowd erupted. Laughter bounced off the barn walls. Someone hooped. Another clapped. Margaret didn't move. Thomas, eyes wide, raised his hand and called out, "I'll give $10. The room howled. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of her chair. Her face burned. She felt every eye darting toward her, then away. Emily stood with a proud, playful smile, as if she had delivered the perfect punchline. To her, it was all a joke. Margaret forced a laugh. It sounded foreign in her throat. Her lips trembled. She nodded slightly, pretending to find it amusing, but her stomach turned and a sharp pain ran up her spine. The lights above blurred for a moment. She had spent her life swallowing hurt, brushing off snubs, telling herself not to take things personally. But this was something else. Her illness wasn't secret. She never expected pity, only dignity. And now, here she was being auctioned off like a burden. A joke. The laughter slowly faded, but something inside her cracked, silently, invisibly. And while everyone else turned their attention back to the next speech or the next dance, Margaret sat motionless in her chair. Because something in that moment, something she couldn't yet name, had changed. The air in the barn seemed thinner after Emily's toast. As laughter from the auction subsided, conversations resumed, music swelled again, and servers glided between tables refilling drinks. But Margaret remained still, her hand resting on the cool rim of her untouched water glass. Around her, the wedding party danced, drank, and celebrated as if nothing unusual had just happened. But inside Margaret, a quiet tremor had begun. Not of anger, not yet, but of something harder to name. Something colder. Something that made her feel like a guest at her own humiliation. She excused herself from the table and walked out into the night air. The crickets chirped steadily in the distance, and the faint glow of string lights danced against the dark silhouette of the trees. Her steps were slow, cautious, but not only because of her illness. The ache in her chest wasn't physical. She stopped near the edge of the field, where the grass was tall and the sound of the party dimmed. For a long moment, she simply stared at the stars. The stillness helped, but her thoughts circled back to one thing, her son's laughter. It hadn't been a defensive chuckle or a confused laugh. He had leaned into it, played along, offered $10 like her dignity had a price. She rubbed her eyes. Her hand trembled slightly. "Thought I'd find you out here." The voice was soft, familiar in tone, but not in memory. Margaret turned to see a man in a dark blue vest and rolled sleeves stepping toward her. His name tag read Caleb. He carried 2 glasses of sweet tea. "I'm one of the coordinators," he explained, offering her a glass. "Saw you step out. Sometimes weddings get a little overwhelming." She hesitated before accepting the glass. "That's a kind way to put it." He gave her a knowing smile. "We'd had brides faint, grooms locked themselves in restrooms, 2 runaway flower girls, and once, believe it or not, a cake fire. Yours isn't the strangest wedding we've hosted." "Somehow, that's comforting," she said, though her voice held little humor. Caleb stood with her for a moment in silence. Then, with a gentle tone, he asked, "Are you all right?" She took a sip of the tea, then looked out over the field again. "No, but I'm used to it." He didn't press. Instead, he nodded, gave a polite goodbye, and walked back toward the barn. Margaret stayed where she was, letting the quiet settle in again. The moment was short-lived. From the direction of the barn came a sharp clatter. A champagne glass had dropped. Margaret turned instinctively. Laughter. Someone screamed playfully. More music. She didn't want to go back in, but she couldn't stay out forever. She gathered herself, smoothed her dress, and returned. Inside, the tempo had shifted. A DJ had taken over the playlist. The first dance was done. The floor was now packed with couples swaying to upbeat pop songs, while others gathered at the photo booth or refilled their plates at the dessert table. Emily, radiant in her strapless gown, posed with her friends, raising her arms dramatically as someone snapped a photo. Margaret stood near the edge, unnoticed. She watched Thomas spin Emily playfully before dipping her in an exaggerated motion. Guests clapped. Flashbulbs popped. Margaret wondered how much of the night had already been uploaded to social media. She didn't see it coming. The next sting. A group of younger guests had gathered near the bar. A man with slick back hair and a floral tie lifted his glass and called out, $10 still stands. Where's the old gal? More laughter. A woman nearby chimed in, Only 10? I'll throw in a bag of cough drops and a heating pad. Even the bartender chuckled. Margaret didn't flinch this time. She simply turned away and made her way back to her table. On her way, she passed Thomas and Emily, now talking with Emily's parents. "Mom," Thomas called, noticing her. "There you are." She paused. "I just needed some air." Emily turned toward her with a smile, too wide to be genuine. "Hope we didn't scare you off with my little joke." Margaret forced herself to look her in the eye. "I wasn't aware I was part of the entertainment." Emily laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on. Everyone knew it was a joke. It got people laughing, didn't it?" "It did," Margaret said calmly. "Just not me." Thomas stepped in, his tone soft but patronizing. "It was harmless, Mom. You're being too sensitive." Emily meant no disrespect. Margaret looked at her son. "You offered $10. His face changed, and not out of shame, but mild irritation. "It was a bit, okay? Everyone was joking. Let's not make a scene." "I didn't make a scene," she said quietly. "You did." Emily rolled her eyes and turned back to her mother, whispering something Margaret didn't catch. The older woman nodded, casting a glance Margaret's way that made her feel like a child being assessed for bad manners. Margaret walked away before she said anything else she might regret. She returned to her table, sat down, and took a deep breath. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The speeches faded into white noise. The music became a steady thump in her head. Guests began leaving. Sparklers were handed out. A tunnel of light formed for the couple's exit. Margaret remained seated, watching as Thomas and Emily ran to the corridor of flickering lights, guests cheering and tossing rose petals. Flashbulbs lit their faces, beaming euphoric, untouched by anything that had transpired earlier. No one noticed the mother of the groom didn't rise. No one asked her to join the tunnel. After the send-off, the crowd began to thin. Staff cleared tables. Empty glasses clinked together in bus tubs. Chairs were stacked. Margaret stood and began making her way toward the exit, her joints aching. As she passed the dessert table, she overheard two guests chuckling. "Imagine getting auctioned off at your own son's wedding," one said. "That poor woman. What a mood killer." "I thought it was hilarious," the other replied. "Emily's got guts." Margaret didn't stop walking, but she carried those words with her all the way to her car. Inside the vehicle, silence welcomed her. She gripped the steering wheel and stared ahead at the gravel road, lit only by the low beams of the parking lot lights. Her fingers were cold. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat, alone, the engine off, while the weight of something long buried began to rise. Something she hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not grief, but the unmistakable crack of dignity being pushed too far. Something inside Margaret had shifted, and it would not be shifting back. Margaret was nearly at the parking lot when she heard the loud clatter of a dropped microphone echo through the barn, followed by a burst of muffled gasps and shifting voices. She paused, hand on her car door, uncertain whether to ignore it or investigate. Something in the tone of the crowd pulled at her instincts. Not laughter this time, but confusion. A shift in the atmosphere, as though someone had lit a match in a room full of gas. Curiosity overtook her. She turned around, retracing her steps slowly, re-entering the barn through the side entrance near the catering station. The lights inside were still glowing warmly, but the mood had changed. People were no longer dancing. Servers had stopped moving. Conversations had paused mid-sentence. Margaret stepped around a stack of unused plates and caught sight of the main area. Standing near the center of the dance floor, surrounded by a half-circle of stunned guests, was a man in a tailored navy suit, sharp black shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a quiet confidence that made everyone else seem suddenly smaller. He held a microphone in one hand, removed his sunglasses with the other, and placed them neatly in the pocket of his jacket. His face, though older, carried a familiar gravity, the sort of face Margaret hadn't seen in decades, yet one she would recognize anywhere. Her breath hitched. Lucas Harrington. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in over 40 years. She hadn't even allowed herself to think about him more than fleetingly. He belonged to another life, a chapter closed so firmly she believed the pages had disintegrated. Yet here he stood, taller than she remembered, the silver in his hair lending him an air of seasoned elegance, like someone used to rooms like this. But what struck her most was not that he was here. It was the words he had just spoken, the ones that had sent a ripple of silence through the room. "I offer $3 million, he had said. Now, standing calmly beneath the canopy of Edison bulbs, he repeated it. $3 million, for the woman you all found so amusing. Margaret's heart pounded. Her knees weakened, not from illness but from shock. Someone near the bar muttered, "Is this a stunt?" Another whispered, "Who is he?" Emily, at the far end of the dance floor, stood motionless, her complexion ghostly white. Then, with a sudden jolt, she dropped the champagne flute she'd been holding. The glass shattered at her feet. Her knees buckled. Two bridesmaids rushed forward, but not fast enough to stop her from crumpling onto the floor. A shriek rose from the crowd. Thomas appeared from somewhere near the stage, pushing through guests. "Emily!" he yelled, crouching beside her. "Someone call a medic." Lucas stepped back without a word, letting the chaos unfold around him. He glanced once in Margaret's direction, and though their eyes didn't meet directly, the gesture was enough to make her pulse race. Medics arrived quickly. A staff member had already called the local EMTs when the bride collapsed. As they examined Emily, Thomas looked up red-faced and scanned the crowd. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He turned, as if addressing the room rather than Thomas alone. "Forgive the interruption," he said, "but some jokes come at too high a cost. Tonight I saw a woman, someone I knew once very well, be treated like a punchline. That price? Unacceptable." The murmur among guests deepened. A few people pulled out their phones. Others shook their heads, unsure whether to be offended or awed. Lucas stepped off the dance floor and approached the edge of the room where Margaret now stood frozen. Her feet refused to move, her voice sealed inside her throat. She hadn't seen him since she was 21, since the day she walked away from a life she could no longer hold. Now, at 64, with a body that betrayed her and a family that had just humiliated her, she found herself facing the one person she had never imagined crossing paths with again. "Margaret," he said softly. She flinched as if hearing her name from him had cracked something inside her. She found her voice barely. "Lucas." Their eyes met fully now, and in the quiet between them was a world neither had spoken of in over 4 decades. Thomas stood behind them, still furious, still confused. "Do you know this guy?" he asked his mother, voice sharp. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at Lucas. "Why are you here?" His expression softened. "We'll talk, but not here, not with an audience." "Too late for that," Thomas muttered. The medics were now helping Emily to her feet. She waved them off weakly, demanding to be taken home, saying she didn't want to be seen like this. Her father spoke quickly with one of the coordinators, arranging a car. Margaret turned away from the commotion and followed Lucas toward the side door. Guests parted for them as they passed, some whispering, others openly staring. Margaret didn't care. Her legs ached, her hands trembled, and her mind was trying to piece together too many years at once. But her heart, that old, guarded heart, was beating like it hadn't in a long time. Outside, the air was cool and sharp against her skin. Lucas led her a short distance from the building, away from the remaining lights and eyes. He didn't speak until they reached a quiet spot near the edge of the property, where a wooden bench sat beneath a crooked oak. "Would you sit?" he asked. She did, slowly, grateful for the chance to rest. He remained standing, looking out toward the darkened hills. "I came here because I heard about your illness," he said. "A mutual friend from college mentioned it in passing. I didn't even know you were living nearby." "I'm not," she said. "I live 2 hours from here. This wedding was an obligation." "I figured," he said. There was a long silence. Margaret finally asked, $3 million? What were you thinking?" Lucas turned, his voice low. "I wasn't joking. That trust has existed for 15 years. In your name. It was meant for when the time was right." She blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because once," he said, "you mattered more than anything, and I was too much of a coward to fight for that." She looked away, but not before he saw the shimmer in her eyes. "I have so many questions," she whispered. "And I'll answer every one of them," he said. "But first I needed you to know, tonight wasn't about theatrics. It was about finally standing up, not just for you, but for everything we lost." Somewhere behind them, the barn lights dimmed. Guests continued to trickle out, but Margaret no longer heard the music or the chatter. Her world had narrowed to this bench, this man, an impossible reality of the moment she was now living. He sat beside her. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Regret what?" "Walking away. From us." She looked at him, her voice steady. "I did. For a long time. But life doesn't let you carry regret forever. It either drowns you or teaches you how to swim." He nodded, slowly. "Then maybe we still have time. To swim." She didn't answer. Not yet. But she didn't walk away either. The next morning brought no peace. The sky hung low with a thick layer of clouds, and Margaret sat in a worn armchair by her bedroom window, staring out at the wet driveway, where yesterday's rose petals still clung to the edges of the concrete, like wilted confetti. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lucas again. Not just a man who appeared so suddenly the night before, but the boy she had once loved. The boy she had swore herself to, then left behind. There were questions she hadn't asked him, answers she wasn't sure she wanted. She had hoped the way of the past would stay buried, but the way Lucas had looked at her, with recognition, with memory, told her that the past wasn't done with her yet. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She ignored it. After a few moments, it buzzed again, then a third time. With a resigned sigh, she picked it up and saw the name, Thomas. The messages came in quick bursts. "Can we talk?" "I don't know who that guy is, but I'm assuming you do." Emily's parents are furious. She's humiliated. Then, "Please, Mom, what's going on?" She typed back slowly, "Not now." He replied almost instantly. "When then?" "Because we're all confused and no one knows what to tell the guests who saw what happened. Emily's dad wants to know if the guy was some old flame or a scam artist." She put the phone down. The implication stung, not because she was ashamed of the past, but because her own son saw her as someone who could be conned, who might have hidden something shameful. There had never been room in their dynamic for her history, her heart. It had always been mother as caregiver, mother as provider, mother as background figure. And maybe she had let it be that way. But not anymore. A knock at the door startled her. She rose with caution and crossed the living room to the front hallway. Peering through the peephole, her breath caught. Lucas. He stood holding a plain brown envelope, his posture still and patient. He wasn't dressed in a suit this time, just dark jeans, a collared shirt, and a navy raincoat. Something about the simplicity of his appearance made him seem even more real, and even harder to face. She opened the door slowly. "I thought you might want this," he said, holding out the envelope. "What is it?" she asked. "Closure," he replied. "Or maybe just a reminder." She hesitated before taking it. The envelope was thick, unsealed. She could feel the weight of paper inside. "I was going to wait," he said. "But I figured you want to know what I've been carrying before we talk again." She stepped aside. "Do you want to come in?" He paused. "Only if you want me to." "I do." Inside, he took in the quiet house. The muted colors, the worn furniture, the photos of Thomas through the years. No photos of her late husband. Just her and her son. She sat, gesturing for him to do the same. The envelope remained in her lap. "I didn't expect to ever see you again," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I never stopped thinking about you." That made her laugh, not out of joy, but disbelief. "It's been more than 40 years, Lucas." "I remember every single one of them," he said. "Not all of it clearly, but you were never erased." She looked down at the envelope, then opened it. Inside were 2 letters, both yellow with age, folded neatly. One was in her own handwriting. She froze. "This is mine." "Yes," he said quietly. "Your roommate gave it to me the day you left." She stared at him, stunned. She wasn't supposed to. "I asked about you," he continued, "and she said you didn't want to be found. But when I insisted, she gave me that letter. I read it maybe 100 times over the years. Margaret unfolded it slowly. It was a letter she had written the night before she left campus for good. Never mailed, never meant to be seen. It was raw, painful, honest. She remembered writing it through tears, too ashamed to send it, too broken to explain why she had to disappear. "I was pregnant," she said suddenly, eyes still fixed on the paper. "I know," he replied. "The letter said so. I lost the baby a few weeks later. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. You had your future lined up. Law school, your family, the firm waiting for you. My future was you," he said. "But I understand now. Maybe not then. Back then I was angry. I thought you'd abandoned me. Later, I realized I'd abandoned you first." She looked up at him. "How?" "By not seeing what you were going through. My family scared you, and I didn't protect you. I should have seen how isolated you felt." She nodded slowly. "They were cruel. My father paid your roommate to convince you to leave." Margaret's head snapped up. "I didn't know until years later," Lucas continued. "But he wanted you gone. Said you were a distraction, not the right match." Her hands tightened around the letter. "I should have guessed. I wanted to tell you all this sooner," he said. "But after I found out you'd moved on, married, had a child, I didn't want to reopen old wounds. So I set up the trust, just in case. I thought maybe one day, if you needed help, that money could do something for you. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything." But she did. She had to ask what had been growing in the back of her mind since the wedding. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here publicly like that?" He hesitated before answering. "Because seeing you humiliated like that, it did something to me. And because I knew if I didn't speak up then, I'd lose the chance forever." She sat quietly, letting the truth settle around her like dust. "What are you hoping for, Lucas?" "I don't expect anything," he said. "But I'd like to be part of your life again, even if only as a friend." She looked at him, really looked at him. The man he had become, the echoes of the boy she had loved, and the years between them filled with pain neither had dared to voice. "I don't know what I want yet," she said. "I can live with that." Outside, the clouds began to shift, letting in a thin sliver of light. Margaret glanced down at the letter again, her own words from decades ago trembling in her hands. Words of love, fear, and impossible choices. And for the first time since the wedding, she felt something other than shame, something closer to strength. A tiny flicker of it, perhaps, but real. The past had returned, and with it, a chance to decide who she would be, not just who she had been. By the following afternoon, Margaret's name had already passed through the mouths of more strangers than she could count. Emily's wedding, once meant to be a carefully curated symbol of status and perfection, had become the town's most irresistible piece of gossip. It was the kind of scandal that didn't just hover for a weekend. It dug in, rewrote reputations, and lit up neighborhood brunches with speculation. Margaret felt the shift immediately. Calls she would normally ignore started coming from people she barely remembered. Her neighbor Sue accidentally left a basket of scones on her porch with a card that read, "Thinking of you," in a hurried scrawl. Her church's prayer group leader emailed her offering support for what you're going through, even though she hadn't attended a service in almost a year. But none of them knew the truth. Not really. They only had a few fragments. The mysterious man at the wedding, the outrageous offer, the bride's collapse, and the mother of the groom walking away in silence. Thomas hadn't called again. Not since she texted him. Not now. She sensed he was stewing, more concerned about perception than people. Margaret knew him well enough to predict the script. He'd spent a few days trying to control the narrative, to shield Emily's family, to apologize to guests for the outburst, and only later come to her, when the heat had cooled, hoping to explain things away. But Margaret wasn't waiting. Instead, she was focused on something Lucas had said. A single detail that hadn't left her mind since the moment he spoke it. Her college roommate had been paid to push her out of his life. It had stunned her, yes, but more than that, it unlocked a door inside her mind that she didn't even realize had been closed. After Lucas left her house, she pulled an old box from the attic. It was covered in dust marked Thomas, baby years, but she knew it held more than that. Tucked underneath childhood drawings and maternity photos were journals, ones she had kept sporadically between the ages of 19 and 22. She hadn't opened them in over 3 decades. She sat on her bedroom floor with her back against the bed, flipping through pages brittle with time. The entries were raw, rambling, and young. But then, just halfway through one of the later journals, she found it, a passage dated 2 weeks before she left college. Her handwriting was shaky, anxious, and the words hit her like a slap. Rebecca said Lucas didn't ask about me, that he told her he didn't want to deal with me anymore. I didn't want to believe it, but she was insistent. Said I was in his way. I thought he loved me. I guess I was wrong. Margaret stared at the entry for a long time. Rebecca, she hadn't thought about her roommate in decades. A political science major, always precise, calculating. She had introduced Margaret to Lucas in the first place, at a campus debate. At the time, Margaret thought it was just fate. Now she saw it for what it was, an arrangement. She had believed Rebecca. She was 19, pregnant, and alone, and someone she trusted had looked her in the eye and told her she was nothing more than an obstacle. No wonder she ran. The memory ached. Later that evening, Margaret made a decision. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years, found in the back of an old address book. It rang twice before a woman answered. "Hello? Rebecca?" Margaret's voice was tentative. There was a pause on the other end. "Yes, who is this?" "It's Margaret." Another pause, longer this time. "Margaret Hale? From Carolina?" "Yes." "Well, I'll be," Rebecca said, her tone half wary, half amused. "Didn't think I'd hear your voice again. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." A short laugh came through. "After all this time? I'm not calling for closure. I just want to understand what happened." Rebecca sighed. "You're talking about Lucas." "Yes." There was a silence that stretched so long Margaret thought the line had dropped. Then Rebecca spoke, the casual sharpness gone from her voice. "I did what I was asked to do. I was young and stupid. His father offered me $2,000 to make sure you left. Said if I convinced you that Lucas wanted you gone, they'd take care of my tuition. I justified it at the time. Told myself it was just a push. You were already scared, already pulling away. I didn't think you'd vanish." Margaret's throat tightened. "You lied to me." "Yes," Rebecca admitted, "and I've regretted it more times than I can count. But I figured if you made a life, if you were happy, maybe it didn't matter." "It mattered," Margaret said flatly. "It changed everything." "I know," Rebecca replied quietly. "I'm sorry." Margaret ended the call soon after. She sat in the silence of her room, the phone resting on her lap. The journal spread around her like artifact from a life she never got to live. The confirmation left her feeling oddly still, not angry, not vindicated, just sober. 43 years of believing she had been abandoned, when in truth, she had been manipulated. And yet, something unexpected rose in her. Not just sorrow, not bitterness, resolve. She closed the journal, gathered the contents back into the box, and placed it gently beneath her bed. Then she stood, stretched her back, and crossed the room to her closet. From a far corner, she pulled out a suitcase, a small one. It was time to go see Lucas. This time, not in secret, not in confusion. She needed to face the truth, not just the one that hurt, but the one that might heal. The next morning, she arrived at the address he had scribbled on a card before leaving her house. A quiet brick home on the edge of the neighboring town. Simple, clean, surrounded by tall pines and a white fence. He answered the door quickly, as if he had been waiting. "Morning," he said, stepping aside. "I need to talk," she said, stepping in. "I hoped you would." They sat in his kitchen, sunlight pouring through wide windows. She told him everything. The journal, the call to Rebecca, the lie she had believed, the shame she carried, the baby she lost. He listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on hers, not with pity, but with understanding. When she finished, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You were 19, he said, And no one should have gone through what you did. I thought I was protecting you, she said. But all I did was disappear. We both disappeared, he replied. But we're here now. Margaret exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. We can't get those years back, she said. No, Lucas said, but we can choose what to do with the ones ahead. And for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the story of her life wasn't finished yet. Margaret wasn't prepared for what came next. Just 2 days after her meeting with Lucas, the doorbell rang in the late afternoon. She had been sitting on her porch with a cup of herbal tea, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across her lawn. She didn't recognize the silhouette on the other side of the frosted glass at first, but the knock that followed was unmistakably impatient. When she opened the door, Thomas stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, phone in hand. He wasn't dressed for a visit. He wore the same button-up shirt from work, sleeves rolled hastily, collar half unbuttoned, and his brow glistened with frustration. His car was still running in the driveway. You could have told me, he said before she even greeted him. Told you what? That the man who caused a scene at my wedding was your ex-boyfriend. That he wasn't just some stranger who wandered in off the street. Margaret stepped aside. Come in. He entered reluctantly, as if every piece of furniture offended him. She closed the door and turned to face him. He didn't sit. Instead, he hovered near the center of the living room, phone clenched tightly in one hand. Emily's parents are threatening to demand a public apology, he said. They say Lucas humiliated her in front of all their guests, that it turned their daughter's wedding into a joke. Margaret gave a bitter smile. I wasn't the one who made the wedding a joke. Thomas flinched. I told you already, it was meant to be lighthearted. She walked past him slowly, setting her cup down on the coffee table. You told me I was being sensitive, that it was harmless. Now you're here to defend the people who laughed while I was auctioned off for $10. He turned toward her, defensive. That's not fair. No, she said. What's not fair is how easily you sided with the people who made me feel like nothing. What's not fair is how you haven't once asked how I felt that night. Not after the joke, not after Lucas spoke, not even after Emily fainted. You're only here now because you're afraid of how it looks. He lowered his voice, angry now, because it does look bad, Mom. Not just for Emily, but for me, for both of us. People are calling me asking if I knew this man, if I knew you had some dramatic past. Some are saying it's why you were acting strange at the reception, like you were trying to hijack the attention. She stepped back as if struck. You really believe that? I don't know what to believe anymore, he said, finally sitting, gripping the edge of the couch cushion. You've never talked about your past. Never told me anything about this man. You raised me alone and never explained why. I had questions, and every time I asked, you gave me pieces, never the whole story. I gave you what I could, she said, quieter now. And maybe I made a mistake trying to protect you from the rest. He looked at her sharply. Protect me from what? She sat opposite him. From disappointment. From knowing how badly I was hurt. From understanding that your mother, for all her strength, was once manipulated and discarded by people she thought she could trust. I didn't want that pain shaping how you saw the world. Thomas fell silent. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room. After a moment, he asked, Are you still in love with him? Margaret shook her head. That's not the right question. Then what is? She looked him in the eyes. The right question is why it took someone from my past, a man I hadn't seen in 40 years, to be the only one to stand up for me in that room. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. His shoulders slumped. I didn't know what to do, he said. Everything happened so fast. One moment Emily's making a joke. People are laughing, and then this man stands up and says something insane. I panicked. Margaret's voice softened. It wasn't insane. It was symbolic, and it shouldn't have taken someone offering money for you to realize that I deserve respect. Thomas leaned back. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, she said, but you did. And it wasn't just that night. It's been years of small cuts, overlooked birthdays, rushed phone calls. I felt myself disappearing from your life piece by piece. The words hung heavy in the room. Thomas rubbed his eyes. "So now what?" "You think I know?" she asked, letting out a breath. "I'm figuring it out just like you are. But I won't pretend anymore. I won't hide my past." Lucas came back because he saw what others refused to see. "That matters to me." "Are you going to see him again?" "I already have," she said. He looked down, then slowly nodded. "You know Emily's not going to let this go." "I figured," she said, "but I'm done trying to make her comfortable at my expense." He stood. "I should get back." "Drive safe," she said, walking him to the door. At the threshold, he turned to her. "Mom, I'm sorry. Really." She gave a slow nod. "Then prove it, not with words, with time." He left, and Margaret stood in the doorway long after his car disappeared down the road. That evening, Margaret sat on her back porch with Lucas. He had arrived without fanfare, carrying a bag of groceries and a bottle of white wine. "You knew he'd come," Lucas said, pouring her a glass. "I hoped," she replied, "but I didn't expect it to go like that." "He'll come around," Lucas said. "It's not easy seeing your parents as people." "No," she agreed, "but it's necessary." They sat in silence, the cicadas humming in the trees. Margaret felt the tightness in her chest easing, just slightly. She sipped the wine and looked up at the sky, now turning a soft blue-gray. "You know," she said, "for all the pain that night brought, it also gave me something." "What's that?" "A mirror, when I couldn't avoid. I saw myself the way others saw me, disposable, fading, irrelevant. And I realized I don't want to be that version of myself anymore." Lucas raised his glass. "To the version they'll never see coming." They clinked glasses gently, the quiet between them no longer strained, but full of the unspoken agreement that the past had confronted the present, and the future was finally theirs to decide. The morning after Thomas's tense visit, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. A strange lightness stirred in her chest. Not the absence of pain, but the beginning of space around it. After years of holding everything inside, of measuring her words, of putting the needs of others before the truth of her own experience, something had finally cracked open. And for once, she didn't feel ashamed of it. She spent the early hours organizing her kitchen, not out of necessity, but because her mind needed motion. As she placed mugs and dishes into new spaces, her thoughts turned to Lucas. There were still so many questions between them. Despite everything they'd shared in the last few days, there remained an unspoken tension, a line neither had crossed, perhaps out of fear that once they did, there would be no turning back. By mid-morning, she made the call. Lucas answered on the second ring. "I was about to call you," he said. "Want to come over for lunch?" "Only if we can have a real conversation this time," she said. "Real as in no more pauses, no more editing." Lucas was quiet for a second, then said, "I'll make the coffee." Margaret arrived at his place just after noon. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted vegetables. Lucas had laid out a simple lunch: grilled chicken, herb potatoes, and a crisp salad. They ate outside on his back deck, surrounded by pines and a quiet rustling of wind through branches. It was peaceful, but beneath the calm lay something charged, like static before a summer storm. When they finished, Lucas cleared the dishes and returned with 2 mugs of coffee. He sat across from her, elbows resting on the table, fingers laced. "I wanted to have this conversation for a very long time," he said. "So have I," she replied. "But I think we both need to accept something before we begin." "What's that?" "That the past can't be fixed. Not really. We can understand it, maybe even forgive it, but we can't rewrite it." He nodded, agreed. Margaret took a slow sip from her mug. "When I left, I wasn't just scared. I was shattered. I didn't feel like I had any control over my life anymore. Everything felt like it was happening to me, not for me, not with me. And when Rebecca lied, I believed her because it confirmed what I feared most, that I was alone, that I was unworthy." Lucas's eyes didn't leave hers. "I failed you too, Margaret. I was so caught up in trying to prove myself to my father that I stopped listening to you. I stopped seeing you. You were young," she said softly. "So was I, and everything happened so fast." He leaned forward. When I found out the truth about the baby, about Rebecca, about why you left, it broke something in me. I didn't chase you. I should have. But I let pride win. She nodded, her voice quiet. And I let fear win. The moment held stillness, but not silence. It was a kind of stillness that existed when nothing more needed to be said. Not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had finally been allowed to take up space between them. Then Margaret asked a question that had been pressing at her chest. Since their reunion, why did you never reach out, not even once, after you learned the truth? Lucas hesitated. I did. Once. About 10 years ago. I wrote you a letter, but I never sent it. I was married then. It didn't last long, but at the time, I thought reaching out would only complicate your life. I figured, if you were happy, I had no right to interfere. Margaret frowned. You were married? Yes, he said, briefly. No children. It wasn't right. I kept thinking about someone else. She swallowed. You don't owe me explanation for your life, Lucas. Maybe not, but I want to give them anyway. He paused, choosing his words carefully. After you left, I buried myself in work, graduated top of my class, joined the firm, did everything my father wanted, but it never felt like a win. It felt like a debt. And when I found out what he had done, when I learned he'd paid Rebecca, I confronted him. He didn't deny it, said he was protecting the family name. Margaret looked away. Lucas continued, his voice harder now. That was the day I quit the firm. I walked out and I never looked back. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I didn't want my pain to eclipse yours, he said. You suffered more. You lost more. She shook her head. Pain doesn't compete. Lucas smiled faintly. Maybe, but I still carried guilt. And when I heard about your illness, that was the moment I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. She blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. You still haven't told me what the trust is for, she said, gently shifting the conversation. He nodded. It's for you, for whatever you want. Medical care, travel, starting something new. It's not a favor. It's not charity. It's just my way of acknowledging the life we lost and giving something back to the woman who gave me the best years of my youth. I don't know if I can accept that. You already have, he said. When I spoke at the wedding, I wasn't just standing up for you. I was standing up for the version of you that never stopped existing in my memory. The one who challenged me, laughed with me, believed in me. She deserves a new chapter. Margaret's hands tightened around her mug. I don't know who I am without the role of caretaker. I've spent decades in that identity. Mother, patient, widow. I don't know what comes next. Lucas reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. Whatever it is, he said, you don't have to figure out alone. Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked past him into the trees, where sunlight flickered through green leaves like it was trying to write something across the sky. Eventually, she looked back at him. Her voice was steady. I don't want to go backward, Lucas. I don't want to try to recapture who we were. He nodded. I don't either. But I would like to see who we could be. Now. Lucas's smile was quiet, genuine. Then let's find out. They sat there for a long time, not planning the future, not dissecting the past, just existing in a rare kind of peace. And as the wind moved through the trees around them, Margaret finally let go of the years that had weighed so heavily on her shoulders. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. And sometimes, that's all healing really needs. Not perfection, not resolution, just enough light to see a new path forward. By Friday evening, the silence between Margaret and her son had stretched into something dense and uncertain. Their last conversation, though raw and honest, hadn't settled anything. It only opened the door to everything Thomas hadn't been willing to face. Margaret could feel in the stillness of her house, the way her phone sat untouched for hours, the absence of his name on her screen. But what she didn't expect was that the next confrontation wouldn't come from Thomas at all. It would come from Emily. The knock was abrupt, rapid, and unmistakably irritated. Margaret opened the door to find Emily standing on the porch, arms crossed, keys in hand, sunglasses pushed up onto her head, revealing tired, bloodshot eyes. Do you have a minute? Emily asked, not waiting for an invitation, as she stepped past the threshold. Margaret shut the door slowly and turned to find Emily pacing the living room. As if rehearsing lines she wasn't sure she could deliver with the right balance of grace and fury. "I figured I'd come in person," Emily said, since texts apparently go ignored now. Margaret didn't respond. She simply moved to the armchair and sat down, motioning for Emily to speak. "So," Emily began, facing her with arms folded again, "what exactly are we supposed to tell people? Because as of this week, your little stunt has turned our wedding into some sort of gossip tabloid headline. My father had to pull out a regional chamber event because people were asking if his daughter married into a family with mental instability." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Mental instability? Well, what do you expect?" Emily snapped. "You've got some stranger offering millions for you like he's buying a painting at Sotheby's. And then you walk off like some tragic heroine from a soap opera. People are speculating. They're asking if you've been in and out of hospitals, if you're in debt, if this was all some kind of long game." Margaret leaned forward, calm but unshakable. "And what do you think, Emily?" Emily laughed bitterly. "I think you've embarrassed us. I think you managed to turn a day that was supposed to be about me and Thomas into something entirely about you. And now, instead of enjoying our first week as newlyweds, we're putting out fires." Margaret watched her carefully, seeing not just the fury, but the insecurity behind it. The cracks in Emily's carefully managed exterior were beginning to show, and Margaret knew it had less to do with public perception and more to do with the fact that, for once, she had not been the one in control. "You made a joke, Emily," Margaret said softly. "You used me as the punchline. And when someone called you out on it, you fainted." Emily's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't why I fainted. I was overwhelmed. You were shocked someone stood up for me. That someone dared to say, in front of everyone, that I mattered." Emily's nostrils flared. "You don't get to twist this around." "I'm not twisting anything. I'm just tired of pretending that I don't see what's right in front of me." Emily let out a dry laugh and crossed the room to the window, arms still tightly folded. She stared out for a moment before saying, "You know what really bothers me? That you didn't even try to explain. You let the moment pass. Let everyone stare. You could have said something to calm it down, to protect your son." Margaret stood slowly. "I've spent my whole life protecting my son, even when he didn't see it, even when it cost me my pride. But I won't protect him or you from the consequences of cruelty disguised as humor." Emily turned sharply. "So what now? You and this Lucas person just pick up where you left off? You're going to relive your college love story and hope that gives you some moral high ground." Margaret took a breath, steadying herself. "No, Emily, I'm not reliving anything. I'm reclaiming. There's a difference." Emily stared at her, as if searching for something, maybe a weak spot, maybe regret, but Margaret gave her none. Then Emily asked more quietly, "Do you really think Thomas has been cruel to you?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "I think Thomas has learned how to look past me. I think he's learned how to value what makes his life easier. And I think you, both of you, are more comfortable when I'm small and silent. I'm not blaming you entirely. I helped create that version of myself. But I won't live in it anymore." Emily was quiet. The moment held an unfamiliar heaviness. "You're not who I thought you were," she said. Margaret offered a faint smile. "Neither are you." Emily didn't stay long after that. She left without offering a goodbye, the sound of her car starting echoing down the street as she pulled away. Margaret stood by the window, watching her go. She felt no triumph, no bitterness. Only a firm sense that something long overdue had been said. That evening, Thomas called. "I heard she came by," he said. "She did." He sighed. "She's upset." "So am I." "I know," he said after a pause. I don't know how to fix this." "I'm not asking you to fix it," Margaret replied. "I'm asking you to see it. Really see what's happened. How we got here." "I'm trying," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've been thinking about a lot. About growing up. About how I always thought of you as this invincible figure. You were always the one who handled everything. It never even occurred to me that maybe you needed someone to handle something for you. That's the problem," she said gently. I didn't want to be invincible. I wanted to be loved, seen, not just as a mother, as a person. I think I'm starting to understand that. I hope so, she said, because understanding it is a first step to changing it. There was a long pause on the line. Then Thomas asked almost shyly, "Would you come over for dinner this week? Just the three of us. You, me, and Emily. I think we need to try again." Margaret didn't answer right away. She thought of the years of silence, the jokes brushed off, the casual dismissals, the smile she had forced too many times. And she thought of Lucas, of the conversation they'd had, of the way it felt to be listened to without condition. "I'll think about it," she said. Thomas didn't push. "Okay, let me know." When the call ended, Margaret walked outside and stood barefoot on her lawn. The sky above was turning violet, streaked with early stars. She breathed in the cool air, let it fill her chest. She wasn't ready to forgive everything, but she was no longer afraid of confrontation, no longer afraid of naming what hurt. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like a woman whose story was no longer being written for her, but by her. It was just after 8 o'clock in the morning when Margaret returned to the house she hadn't set foot in for nearly 6 years. The driveway was cracked, the shutters faded from sun exposure, but the bones of the place were unchanged, a small brick bungalow at the edge of her old neighborhood, where Thomas had taken his first steps, where she'd once planted hydrangeas before her illness made even weeding difficult. She had held on to the property, renting it out sporadically over the years. But for the past 18 months, it had been vacant. Too much trouble to manage, too much memory in the walls. Now, standing at the front door with the keys in hand, Margaret felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. Not sorrow, not fear, just weight. The lock clicked open easily. Inside, the air was stale with dust and the faint scent of old wood. Sunlight streamed through the living room window, cutting across the bare floor. The place had been cleared of furniture months ago, but a few cardboard boxes remained near the back hallway. Things she'd stored and forgotten. She walked through slowly, her cane tapping softly with each step. The hallway felt narrower than she remembered. She passed the old bedroom, the closet where she'd once kept a shoebox of letters, until the move when she thought she'd burned them all. But in the last box in the hallway, one labeled M. Books Plus Miscellaneous, she found something she didn't remember packing, a smaller box tucked beneath an old stack of magazines. Inside, tied with twine, were 3 sealed envelopes and a folded photograph. She sat on the edge of the hallway rug, slowly untying the bundle. The photograph was old, creased, the colors faded. It showed her at 20, seated on a park bench, visibly pregnant, her hair windblown and eyes cautious. And beside her, not Lucas, but another man, the same gray-green eyes, the same angular chin. She stared at it for a long time before opening the first envelope. It was a letter she had written but never sent, addressed to Lucas. But it wasn't in her handwriting. It had been typed on a machine, the edges of the paper yellowed. The letter read, "Lucas, I'm writing because I thought you deserved to know. I didn't disappear without reason. And I didn't walk away because I stopped caring. By the time you read this, I may already be gone from your life. But there's something you should know. The child I carried was not yours." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her. She read on, hands trembling. "I had made a mistake before you, and I ever began, a mistake I never told you about. And when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know whose it was. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would raise the baby on my own. But when your father came to me with that check, I took it, not because I didn't love you, but because I believed I wasn't worthy of being with someone like you, not with that kind of lie sitting between us." Margaret let the letter fall onto her lap. Her breath was shallow, and her thoughts scattered. She reached for the second envelope. It was in her own handwriting, dated 10 years later. To Thomas, "I never wanted to lie to you. You were the best thing I ever did, the only thing that kept me standing when everything else fell apart. But the truth is, I never knew with certainty who your father was. I told myself it was Lucas because I needed it to be. I needed to believe the love I had wasn't wasted. But I also knew there was a chance it wasn't him. You were born out of love, yes, but not out of clarity. And I never told you because I thought it would break the world we built." Her eyes filled with tears as she reached for the last envelope, labeled only with the word Lucas. This one was written much later. The handwriting was older, shakier. "Lucas, if you're reading this, then maybe you came back like I always hoped you would. Maybe you forgave me. Maybe you still cared. There's something I never told you, something I buried so deeply I stopped believing it mattered. Thomas might be yours. I don't know. I'll never know now. But the way he carries himself, the way he speaks when he's angry, the way his eyes harden when he feels cornered, he reminds me of you more than I care to admit. I wish I had been brave enough to tell you sooner." Margaret sat still for a long time, the 3 letters laid out before her mind unable to settle on a single emotion. There was grief, yes, and guilt, but also relief. Finally, the truth she had avoided all her life had surfaced, and it was more complex than even she had imagined. She folded the letters carefully, returned them to the box, and took the photograph with her as she left the house. Later that evening, she met Lucas at the edge of the lake near his home, where the water moved slow and quiet beneath the falling light. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I found something," she said, handing him the photograph. He took it gently, eyes narrowing as he studied it. "Where was this?" "In the old house, in a box I know I'd kept." His jaw tightened. "This man beside you, do you remember his name?" "Yes," she said. "He was someone I dated for a few months before we met. It wasn't serious. I never thought I'd see him again. But when I found out I was pregnant, the timelines blurred." Lucas said nothing. He just kept looking at the photograph. Then, finally, he spoke. "Is Thomas my son?" "I don't know," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I told myself he was. I needed to believe it. But I never got a test, never asked. And I buried the doubt because I was terrified of what it would mean for him, for you, for me." Lucas lowered the photograph. "Does he know?" She shook her head. "He doesn't. I don't know if I'll tell him." He looked out over the lake, his eyes unreadable. "Do you want me to be his father?" "I wanted you to be," she said. "I wanted it so badly, I think I convinced myself it was true. But now I just want peace. I don't want to rewrite the past anymore. I just want to live honestly." Lucas nodded, silent for a long time. Then in a low voice he said, "It doesn't change how I feel about you. Or him. If he's mine, I'll carry that. If he's not, I'll still be here. For you. For both of you, if you'll let me." Margaret didn't answer. She simply stepped forward and rested her head on his shoulder, letting the lake breeze wrap around them, letting silence do what words could not. For the first time in a long, long time, the truth had finally been set free, and whatever came next would be built on that, and nothing else. It had rained heavily the night before, leaving the sidewalks damp and the air thick with the scent of wet pine. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea absently, her mind far from the familiar warmth of the room. She had reread the letters that morning, all 3, and the photograph now rested in her purse like a relic she wasn't sure whether to bury or display. She had made a decision. It was time. By early afternoon, she sent a message to Thomas, short and direct. "Please come by today. Bring Emily. There are things I need to say, all of them." It took less than 5 minutes for him to respond. "Are you okay?" "I'm ready," she wrote, "for the truth." They arrived just before 4 o'clock. Thomas entered first, cautious, glancing around the living room as if expecting company. Emily followed a step behind, arms folded, her face unreadable. Margaret met them at the door and guided them into the living room, without ceremony. On the coffee table sat the photograph, the 3 letters, and a manila envelope she had prepared earlier, filled with copies of the contents she had found in the old house. "Sit down," she said, her voice firm. "Both of you." Thomas sat slowly, his brow furrowed. Emily remained standing for a moment before dropping into the armchair across from Margaret, arms still crossed tightly against her chest. "I found something recently," Margaret began, "while cleaning out the old house. Something I should have told you a long time ago." She picked up the photograph and held it out. Thomas took it, studied it briefly, then looked up. "Is this you?" "It is," she said. "Taken when I was about 4 months pregnant with you." Thomas looked confused. "Okay." Margaret took a deep breath, her hands folded on her lap. "That man beside me, he wasn't Lucas." Emily leaned forward, already suspicious. "So who was he?" "A man I dated before Lucas. Briefly. It ended before Lucas, and I became serious. But when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know whose child I was carrying." Thomas blinked. "You never told me this." "I didn't tell anyone," she said. "Not even Lucas. I was 19. I was scared and ashamed. I wrote him a letter trying to explain, but I never sent it. And when his father paid my roommate to push me away, I let myself believe I deserved to disappear." Thomas looked from the photograph to the letters, his expression tightening. "So you're saying you're not sure who my father is?" "I'm saying I never confirmed it. I told myself it was Lucas because that was easier to live within the doubt. But now that he's back, now that you've seen what he's willing to do for me, I couldn't keep lying." Emily let out a soft, bitter laugh. "So you're dropping this now? After all this chaos? After the wedding? After the drama? You're adding a paternity mystery to everything else." Margaret turned to her. "This isn't about you, Emily. Not everything is." Emily opened her mouth, but Thomas raised a hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let her speak." Margaret nodded. "Thankful. I kept this from you because I wanted to protect the life we had. But I realize now that silence didn't protect anyone. It only deepened the cracks between us." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Does Lucas know?" "He does. I told him everything. I showed him the photograph, the letters." "And what did he say?" "He said it doesn't matter, that he's here for me regardless, that he's willing to be part of our lives if we'll have him." Emily leaned forward, incredulous. "So he's just okay with it? With possibly having a grown son he didn't raise?" Margaret looked at her directly. "Yes, because he loved me, and in some way he still does. And maybe more importantly, because he respects me. Something I haven't felt in a long time." Thomas exhaled slowly and leaned back. He looked older in that moment, like the weight of everything was pressing against his spine. "I don't know what to do with this," he said honestly. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Margaret replied, "only to know the truth. And to understand that the woman you think of as your mother is more than the person who packed your lunches and drove you to soccer practice. She's a woman who has lived with heartbreak and secrets and shame, and who is done being silent about any of it." Thomas rubbed his jaw, eyes unfocused. "I guess I always thought you were hiding something," he said. "But I thought it was because you were angry, or that you regretted having me." Margaret felt her chest crack. Never that." "I believe you," he said softly. Emily, still folded tightly into the armchair, looked unconvinced. "So what now? Are we supposed to just accept that our lives have a new supporting character?" Margaret looked at her without blinking. "He's not a supporting character. He's part of my story. And whether or not you choose to include him in yours is your decision." Thomas stood and walked toward the window, silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he asked, "If we wanted to know for sure, if I'm his son, could we find out?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, a test could tell us. But only if you want that. Not out of obligation. Not out of fear." He turned, eyes meeting hers. "I don't know if I do," he admitted. "But I think I want to know him, even if he's not." Margaret felt something lift from her shoulders. Not all the weight, but enough to breathe easier. "That's all I hope for," she said. The room was quiet again. Emily stood abruptly and walked toward the door, keys already in hand. "I need space," she said, more to Thomas than anyone. "I didn't sign up for this." He watched her leave without speaking. When the door shut, he sat back down across from Margaret. "I don't know what kind of son I've been to you," he said after a pause. "But I think I've been blind to the parts of your life that didn't include me." "You were a child," she said. "It wasn't your job to see them. But now, you're not a child anymore. And I won't ask you to protect me, just to recognize me." "I want to try," he said. "I really do." Margaret reached across the table, and took his hand. His fingers curled around hers tightly, like a boy still holding on to something he didn't want to lose. Later, after he left, she stood alone at the window. The rain had started again, soft and rhythmic against the glass. In the kitchen, the manila envelope still sat untouched on the counter. She would leave it there, at least for a while. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about possibility. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. Lucas hadn't intended to return to Margaret's house so soon, but something about their last conversation, the one with Thomas and the letters, the uncertain paternity, and all the silence that followed, left him with a restlessness he couldn't shake. He drove the familiar road slowly, letting the quiet hum of the engine keep pace with his thoughts. He arrived at sunset. The golden light cast long shadows across Margaret's porch, and he noticed a new pot of mums by the door, their yellow petals catching the sun. He smiled at the detail, not because it was remarkable, but because it meant she was still choosing beauty amid everything else. She answered the door quickly, as though she'd been expecting him. "I was just about to put on the kettle," she said. He followed her inside. The house smelled of chamomile and lemon. She moved with a kind of steady grace, slower than when he'd first known her, but more grounded. He watched her pour water into the kettle, place it on the stove, and then sit opposite him at the kitchen table. "Thomas came by," she said. "I assumed he would." "We talked, really talked this time." Lucas waited, giving her space to lead. "I told him everything," she said, "about the letters, the photo, the possibility that you might be his father." Lucas nodded quietly. "And he didn't run," she added. "He stayed. He listened. That's more than most would do." She looked at him then, with something unreadable in her eyes. He asked if we'd ever know for sure. Lucas didn't move. "And what did you say?" I told him it was his choice. That truth doesn't always come from a test. Sometimes it comes from what we're willing to accept. Lucas leaned back slightly. "Would it change anything for you? If he was mine," Margaret thought for a moment, "it would change everything." "And nothing. He's already grown. He's already built. What matters now is how we choose to know each other." Lucas nodded. "That's how I feel too." She paused, hands clasped in front of her. "There's something else." He raised an eyebrow. "I spoke with my doctor last week," she said. "Routine tests, but I've been feeling heavier than usual, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix." Lucas's expression shifted instantly. "What did they say?" "It's not good," she said simply. "The autoimmune disorder has worsened. They're adjusting the treatment, but there are complications now. Organ strain, elevated inflammation levels. It's not immediate, but it's serious." Lucas's jaw tightened. "What are they recommending?" "Rest, limited stress, a more aggressive drug regimen, possibly physical therapy." He leaned forward, voice firm. "You won't go through that alone." She gave him a small smile. "I've spent a long time doing things alone. It doesn't scare me the way it used to, but I won't turn away help this time." Lucas reached across the table and took her hand gently. She didn't pull away. "And that's not all," she added, voice softer. "I found the legal documents tied to the trust, the one you mentioned." His eyes darkened slightly. "You weren't supposed to find that yet." "I read everything," she said. "And what I don't understand is why you named me as the sole trustee of something so large, so permanent." He let go of her hand and leaned back. "Because it wasn't just about you." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucas took a breath. "I set it up 15 years ago, after I learned about your illness. At the time, I didn't know if we'd ever cross paths again. But I told myself that if I could build something, a safety net, a gesture, anything, I would. And when I had the resources, I went further." "How far?" "There's a second clause in the trust," he said. "It activates if I die before you." Margaret stiffened. "It passes everything to Thomas," he continued, "but only under one condition." "What condition?" Lucas looked at her with unwavering calm. "That he never questioned the value of his mother's life again." She blinked. "You wrote that into a legal document?" "I did," he said. I knew I couldn't control how your relationship would evolve. But I wanted to make it clear, in writing, that your life, your worth, your presence in this world, it mattered, even if no one else had the courage to say it. Margaret covered her mouth with one hand, not to hide tears, but a hole in the gas that rose from deep inside. You did all this for me? For both of you, he said, because I loved you, and because he deserved to know the kind of woman who raised him. She lowered her hand slowly. He might never know that, not all of it. Lucas shook his head. Maybe not, but maybe he'll feel it. Maybe he'll carry it with him the way he treats people, the way he listens next time someone speaks their pain. The kettle whistled on the stove, and Margaret rose, almost as if in a daze. She moved to turn off the burner, poured water into 2 mugs, and returned to the table. She set one in front of Lucas, then sat down again. Her hands trembled slightly. No one's ever done something like that for me, she said. Lucas reached for her hand once more. Then it's long overdue. They sat in silence for a while, the steam from their mugs curling into the quiet space between them. After a long pause, Margaret said, I want to make changes too. Lucas looked at her, curious. I've been thinking about writing, she said. Not fiction, not even a memoir, just stories, pieces of my life, the parts no one ever asked about. You should, he said. People need to hear them. I think I need to hear them too, she replied. Out loud, on paper. Lucas gave a gentle nod. Then do it. I'll be your first reader. She smiled softly. You always were. Outside, the evening light was fading, the sky tinged with lavender and gold. A wind stirred through the trees, rustling the leaves as if the world itself were making room for something new. Margaret sipped her tea, then looked across the table, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that her story wasn't ending. It was beginning again, and not because someone had offered her money or protection or even love, but because someone had believed in her value, even when she had stopped believing in herself. That was the twist she hadn't expected, and perhaps the one that mattered most. In the days following their last conversation, something subtle but unmistakable began to change. Not in the weather, though the summer heat had finally started to break, but in the way people looked at Margaret, or more accurately, in the way she looked at herself. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like a guest in her own life. Something had returned to her, not her health, which still required managing, or her past, which remained rooted in memory, but a sense of ownership, of direction. It began with small gestures. She returned to the local library, not as a patron, but as a volunteer. She helped with the cataloging of new donations, answered questions at the front desk, and even offered to lead a monthly life writing circle, not memoir, not fiction, just stories people wanted to tell but never had the chance to write down. The program wasn't advertised loudly, but within 2 weeks, there was a waiting list. Margaret's presence, quiet but consistent, had started drawing people in. Meanwhile, Thomas called more frequently. His tone had softened, and so had his questions. He didn't press for a DNA test, didn't bring up the letters again. He came over once or twice a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with small updates from his job or neighborhood news. Margaret never pushed the conversation further than he was ready to go. She sensed he was rebuilding something, not just between them, but within himself. Emily, on the other hand, had pulled away. She wasn't cruel, not anymore, but distant, formal. When Margaret saw her at family gatherings or brief visits, Emily was polite, composed, careful with her words. The tension remained beneath the surface, and though Margaret no longer shrank under it, she accepted that some fractures didn't heal with time alone. One afternoon, after helping a young girl find a book on constellations, Margaret stepped out of the library and found Thomas waiting by her car. He wore a navy jacket and held 2 coffees, one of which he offered to her as she approached. I figured you'd still drink it black, he said. Some things don't change, she replied, accepting the cup. They sat on a bench just outside, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting on the breeze. I read the letters again. Thomas said after a few quiet sips. Margaret didn't respond. She waited. I think I was more angry at the idea of not knowing than I was about the actual truth, he he said. But lately, I don't know. It's strange, Mom. When I think about who I am, I don't think about biology. I think about Sunday pancakes, you reading to me when I was sick, those ridiculous Halloween costumes you insisted on making by hand. She smiled. The robot suit made of cereal boxes was my masterpiece. It really was, he said, and I realized something. I don't care whose blood is in me. I care whose voice taught me how to speak. Margaret felt her throat tighten. That means more than you know. He looked down, thoughtful, and I've been thinking about Lucas, about what it means for someone to love you that quietly, that consistently. He doesn't want anything in return, she said. I know, he replied, and that's what makes it so hard to process. I'm used to people wanting something. Margaret nodded. He's not trying to replace anyone. I don't think I'd mind if he wanted to stay around, Thomas said. Not as a father, just as someone in my life. The admission surprised her. She looked at him, really looked at him. A man now, no longer the boy she carried on her hip or the teenager who slammed doors when he didn't get his way. He had grown, but more than that, he was growing still. That's your choice, she said. He glanced sideways at her. You always say that now. It's the only honest thing I can offer, she replied. After a pause, he asked, Do you still think about getting the test? I don't, she said. For me, knowing wouldn't bring clarity. It would bring another box to label. And I've spent too many years trying to fit into the right box. Thomas smiled faintly. I think I'm okay not knowing, too. They sat in silence after that, the kind that wasn't heavy or uncomfortable, just full of air that had been cleared. Later that week, Margaret visited Lucas again. This time, she brought a folder. He raised an eyebrow when she handed it to him. What's this? My writing, she said. 3 short pieces. First drafts. He opened it gently, flipping to the handwritten pages. You're really doing it. I promised I would. He looked up. May I read them now? Please. She watched him as he read. He was slow, deliberate, stopping every few paragraphs to glance at her, then continue. When he finished the 3rd piece, he set the folder down. You write like you speak, he said, with weight. I wasn't sure they were any good. They're better than good, he said. They're true. She exhaled, visibly relieved. That's what I was hoping for. Lucas reached for her hand across the table. Do you want to publish them? She blinked. What? I have a friend in Chapel Hill. Runs a small press. They publish local voices, essays, personal histories. He owes me a favor. Margaret hesitated. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Then think about it, he said. Let people hear you. She looked down at the folder, the soft corners of the paper already worn from her fingers. I will, she said. Outside, the world continued. Cars passed, birds chirped, the ordinary rhythm of life moving forward. But inside that room, something shifted. Not a dramatic change, not an epiphany, just a small, sturdy belief that maybe her voice mattered, that maybe it had all along. And as the day wound down, as the shadows lengthened and the quiet deepened, Margaret felt something new. Not forgiveness, not certainty, but peace. A peace that came not from resolution, but from reclaiming what had always belonged to her, her story, her strength, her sense of self. And no matter what came next, she knew she would face it not as someone's mother, someone's patient, someone's burden, but as Margaret, fully and finally herself. 3 months had passed since the wedding. A season's worth of change folded quietly into the rhythm of days that were no longer defined by illness or silence. Margaret had slipped into a new kind of life, one she had never imagined for herself but now embraced with quiet conviction. Not every morning was easy. Her body still reminded her of its limits, but her spirit no longer bent beneath the weight of things unspoken. The library writing circle had grown, and by October, it had outgrown the small side room they'd been using. The librarian offered Margaret the main event space on Tuesday afternoons, and she accepted without hesitation. People came with poems, unfinished letters, journal fragments, stories scribbled on notepads. Some cried while reading. Others simply listened. But week after week, Margaret sat at the center of it all, not as the organizer or facilitator, but as someone finally willing to share her voice alongside everyone else. Lucas came often. He sat quietly in the back, sometimes helping with setup, other times offering coffee to the participants. He never interrupted, but when Margaret read, he always looked at her, not with admiration, but with attention. He made her feel visible in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Thomas had started visiting every Sunday, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. Sometimes they talked about nothing, movies, politics, a book he'd picked up but hadn't finished. Other times, they dove into harder conversations. He'd begun therapy, something Margaret never expected to hear from him. He spoke openly about his shame, his defensiveness, his slow realization that love wasn't measured in perfection, but in presence. Emily's presence had become less frequent. They weren't separated, but the distance between her and Thomas had become more than emotional. Margaret didn't pry. She suspected the fracture between them had less to do with the events at the wedding and more to do with the truth that had been waiting beneath it all. Some relationships couldn't survive honesty, and that was not her burden to mend. One crisp Saturday morning, Lucas picked Margaret up for a short trip. He didn't say where they were going, only that she should wear comfortable shoes. She agreed, more curious and suspicious. They drove north, away from the neighborhoods and shopping centers, into a quieter stretch of countryside. After nearly an hour, he turned onto a gravel road flanked by tall maples just beginning to turn gold and red. At the end of the path sat a modest cottage with blue shutters and a wraparound porch, partially hidden by tall grass and late-season wildflowers. "What is this place?" she asked as he turned off the engine. Lucas looked at her. "A retreat, owned by a friend. He lets writers stay here. A few weeks at a time. Quiet, no internet. Just trees, a fireplace, and enough coffee to keep you up writing until morning." Margaret blinked. "You're suggesting I come here?" "I already arranged it," he said. "If you want it." She stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the view. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves, the kind of scent that reminded her of childhood camping trips and fall walks through the woods behind her old neighborhood. She turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you have a story," he said, "and I think it deserves a place to breathe." She felt tears threaten, but held them back. Instead, she nodded. "A few weeks. However long you need." They walked the grounds together, stepping carefully through the grass. The cottage was simple inside. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a fireplace with stacked wood, and a writing desk by a window that overlooked the trees. Margaret ran her hand along the edge of the desk. "I used to dream about places like this," she said. "Before I had Thomas, before I got sick." Lucas leaned in the doorway. "And now I don't have to dream," she said. She didn't move in right away. She gave herself 2 weeks to prepare. She packed notebooks, pens, a few old journals, and a small box of photos. She didn't tell many people where she was going. Just Thomas, the librarian, and Lucas. On her first night in the cottage, she lit a fire, brewed a pot of tea, and sat at the desk beneath a brass lamp. Outside, wind rustled the trees, and an owl called from somewhere in the dark. She opened a blank notebook, uncapped her pen, and began to write. Not the story of the wedding, not the story of Lucas, but her own story as a woman who had lost things and found others, who had kept too much inside for too long, and who now had the freedom to lay it all down. She wrote for hours. By the end of the second week, she had written nearly 70 pages, and on the 17th day, she gave herself permission to call it a book. Not a masterpiece, not a final truth, but a collection of truths told honestly and with care. When she returned home, Lucas met her at the front door. She handed him the manuscript, wrapped in twine. He took it carefully. "Do I get to read it?" "Yes," she said, "but only after you promise not to tell me it's good." He smiled. "Why not?" "Because it's mine," she said, "and I don't need it to be good. I need it to be real." Later, Thomas came over for dinner. He helped her chop vegetables while she told him about the cottage, the writing, the quiet. When they sat down to eat, he held his glass up and said something that surprised her. "To the version of you I never took time to know," he said. I'm glad I finally met her. She clinked her glass against his. So am I. The legacy of that single moment, that toast at the wedding, cruel and careless, had rippled outward in ways none of them had expected. It had fractured old illusions. It had burned away complacency. But it also made space for something else to rise. Honesty, reconciliation, and the fierce, quiet joy of a woman no longer willing to be an afterthought in her own life. Margaret didn't seek closure anymore. She didn't need every answer. What she had instead was agency. And in that, she had everything she needed. And as autumn settled into the trees and the days grew shorter, she began to plan her next trip to the cottage. Not because she needed to escape, but because she had finally found a place where her voice could echo freely. Her story had been paused, rewritten, silenced, and misunderstood. But now, it belonged entirely to her.